I think wanted to point that out. This is an organization that you may or may not have heard of. This is called the Young Lords. They are very similar to the Black Panthers in New York City and Chicago. And this is that's our symbol for independence in Puerto Rico, as I was talking about earlier. Keep going. Gay pride and the LGBTQ movements at that time. More of that. This is trans woman. That's Sylvia Rivera, who was a trans woman activist at that time. There's now the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in New York City that continues to advocate for trans people. So anti-war movements being led by veterans. Okay. So we talked about COINTELPRO. And I guess it's important to understand that, so we have all of these social movements that are going on, okay? And at the beginning of the 1970s, we start to see this repression of these social movements as people begin to take power. There are these tactics like COINTELPRO that are being used to incarcerate people, leaders of these movements, and assassinate people of these movements. So this right here is a poster of a number of people we call political prisoners. These are people who have been incarcerated for their political beliefs. Many of the faces that you see here are still people who are in prison. These are people who are part of those social movements that we just mentioned that are still sitting in prison to this day. Some of those people have died. Some of them have been freed, but we're still working to heal the consequences that we endured from the repression of those social movements at that time, okay? So this right here is important, I think, to understand, because today you'll hear people talk about prisons. They talk about has anybody ever heard the term the prison industrial complex? Thinking about prisons as about making money. But I think it's important to understand that prisons aren't just about making money. They're not just about profit. They're about social repression. They're about repressing movements. They're about incarcerating Black and Latinx people, and it's not just for money. If we look at this lineage, and in particular at this time where it's in the 1970s, where we really begin to see the groundwork for what we're going to see in a moment, which is mass incarceration as it starts to explode in the 1980s, okay? So I think it's important to understand this piece of the history of prisons in the US. So if you look at it on a graph, okay, so we're talking about, if you look at it on a graph, we're see in the 1960s, it's moving up, 1974, 1978, when a lot of these movements are really hot, we're seeing it move, and then we move into the 1980s. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, what's going on in the 1980s? Does anybody remember a little bit of that history? The war on drugs, right? So now we're seeing, as social movements are building up, Black pride was going strong, and we're seeing Black people and people of color and oppressed people rise up. They have to find, and it's moving all across the world, right? So it's not this type of movement. These movements weren't just happening in the United States; they were happening all over the world, right? So we start to see the government use a new strategy, right? And that new strategy, like, they continue to have to shift the game a little bit, and it was very intentional. In fact, if you watch 13, they'll talk about how it was very intentional, this idea of criminalization through the war on drugs. This was a strategy. I'm going to take questions at the end, but if you can hold on, can you hold that question from? Mm-hmm. Just because I lose my train of thought and I get stuck too quick. So here's an example of what that war on drugs looks like. So we have, and the inequality in the war on drugs, right? So it's not just about, the war on drugs is not just about a war on drugs, but really we're looking at a new way to criminalize people of color, Black and Latinx people in particular. And we see this type of disparity in the sentencing. Okay, so if we look at cocaine and crack are the same drug, okay, in different forms. So we see cocaine, which is predominantly used by white people, crack, which is predominantly used by African American people, okay, and the sentencing disparity, 18-1, okay? If we look at it in terms of the mandatory federal sentence for first-time offenders, 5 grams for powder cocaine is probation, crack, 5 years of incarceration, and so on and so forth. Okay. So today, this is a graph of how many people are locked up in the United States, okay? And we see that we have state prisons as the majority of those, local jails, federal prisons and jails, youth detention centers. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And then that was just a piece of that. So that was, if you look at this green part of the graph, that's just that part. But we also have the correctional population is much, much greater than that. We have probation and also parole, okay? And so this is the total correctional population today, more or less. Probably less, because this number sure has gone up even. And then we look at the racial and ethnic disparities of prisons and jails, okay? Just so that we can see, we know this to be true because we just talked about the history of prisons in this country, but if you look at it from a numbers perspective, okay, this is 13%, Black people make up 13% of the US population and make up 40% of people in prison and jail. Okay, white people, 64% of the US population and only 39% of prison and jail population. And again, Latinx people, 16% of the US population, 19% of those in prison and jail. And I also want to point out that many this number is a little bit inaccurate in the sense that many Latinx people are also Black people. And so oftentimes we have to choose one or the other in terms of how we identify. So you know, some Latinx people might be in one or the other of those numbers. And then we have Native people, 0.9% of the US population and 1% of prison and jail population. And then we see the inequality in terms of the populations of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Now, again, a lot of these numbers are somewhat inaccurate in the sense that how people identify versus how those who are taking these numbers are identifying people are limited in terms of the choices of how people get, in terms of how they identify. We might not have the option, they might have the option to choose to identify the way that they would like to in terms of when they take these numbers. But we have 3.5% of the US population is LGBT. 5.5% of men in prison are gay or bisexual, and 33.3% of women in prison are lesbian and bisexual. So can you go back on that? And I just want to say, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, Americans are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than the general US population. Again, another piece that I wanted to say here is that in terms of trans people in prison, there is not enough information still. There's still, I have a dear friend actually who's been working on doing these studies, and a number of people are working to get more documentation and more numbers, in terms of these studies, but there's still not a lot of information. But what we've been able to gather so far is that trans people are overrepresented and are the most vulnerable of all populations, especially trans people of color are the most vulnerable populations in prisons, the ones that are most likely to deal with the most violence, for example. Thank you. Reports of ever being in solitary confinement, and if yes, total amount of time ever spent in solitary confinement. And we're going to see what that looks like in terms of the number of people and the amount of time that people are dealing with in solitary confinement. 85%. Okay, this is trans people. Discrimination, 70% said yes. Verbal harassment, 70%. Physical assault, 35%. Unwanted touch, 37%. Sexual assault, which is an epidemic for trans people incarcerated, 12%. And then if you look at the numbers of people who have actually gone to trial. So a lot of times we think about people who are incarcerated and you imagine that everybody has gotten a fair trial, right? This is the US, guilty till proven innocent, right? Or innocent till proven guilty. Actually, it's probably the other way around. But most people, 97%, do not even reach trial of criminal cases. Thank you. And we talked a little bit earlier about the prison industrial complex, and most certainly people who are in prison continue to do unpaid labor. Right? So that part is true. It's also true that it's not just about labor, but about social repression. But the prisons are absolutely infiltrated by corporations that use prison populations for paid or low-wage labor, or extremely low-wage labor. And this is just a small snippet of the corporations that participate in this. 93 cents to $4 per day people are paid. And then we see the growing industry. Okay, so in 1990, we're seeing 3 billion, and now in 2010, and these numbers, of course, continue to go up. Over half of this comes from holding facilities for undocumented immigrants. And so we're going to look here at this. This is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE detention facilities. So these are growing detention facilities, which is like another number added on to what we were talking about in terms of incarceration. So these are the number of people, or these are the different locations of people that are in detention facilities. And as we know, with President Trump today, or so-called President Trump today, these detention centers continue to grow, and we're starting to hear in the news, right, about the grotesque abuses that are happening to people, including children, in these detention facilities. Collateral consequences. So the prisons have consequences not just in terms of what's happening within the prisons, but also outside of the prisons. So 6.1 million Americans can't vote because of felony conviction. Okay? 1 of every 13 African Americans has lost their voting rights due to felony disenfranchisement laws. 1 in every 50 children in the United States has a parent in prison. 77% of disenfranchised voters are people living in the community, not behind bars. 48 states bar persons in prison for voting. Okay, we talk about how people in the US have the right to vote, that this is a democracy. But if we're looking at these obscene numbers of people who are incarcerated, and we talk about the right to vote, losing the right to vote once they are released, I mean, this is an epidemic that's taking away our right to a just democracy, right? So this is a graph that is similar to the graph that we were looking at before. But what we're seeing is in 1980, we see it grow, and we are seeing it start to, if you can see right here, that little hill that's moving down right at the top, that's kind of where we are now. So this is the good news. The good news is that, as I spoke of earlier, where oppression has existed, what else has existed alongside it?
Resistance.
Resistance, right? right? So we have social movements that have been moving hand in hand throughout time. And so I didn't talk about this before, but I moved into mass incarceration movements in the 1990s. And this is some of the work that we were doing in the 1990s. This is me and my brother, actually, at a protest movement. So I talked about the political prisoners that were incarcerated in the 1970s. This is us in the 1990s at a protest in Philadelphia to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's a former Black Panther and current political prisoner, who we were able to take off of death row. So he was on death row and he's now off of death row, but we're still working for his freedom. Some of those political prisoners we were able to free, some of them have not been freed. But one of the things that happened in the 1990s with these movements to free political prisoners is that the conversation about what was going on in prisons, Mumia, for example, is a journalist. And so he, from prison, was writing books and doing radio shows to talk about what was happening inside of the prisons. So we were starting to get a glimpse from prison populations themselves and hear about what was happening within those prisons. And then that information was being spread out. So these were the movements in the 1990s that continue to move us forward into what we see today, right? The Black Lives Matter movement didn't come out of a vacuum, right? You think about, one of the things that I find interesting about social media today, for example, is that social media is a really powerful tool, but one thing that I find interesting is that what existed before social media, so what's not accessible on YouTube, is sometimes inaccessible for young people. And so we start to think that the oppression that we're experiencing today just started with Trump presidency, and that the resistance movements that we see today just started with, say, Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. But in fact, these movements are a part of a really long and powerful history. And they have more powerful, but they're more power than we might even understand. And so when we see Black Lives Matter in the street today, we see these buttons on the tables here today. They're not just representing today, but they are representing that powerful legacy, that powerful history that goes all the way back to the Underground Railroad, that goes all the way back to the Bola movements in the Caribbean, that goes all the way back to the moment that oppression has existed, when people rose up and resisted, that it goes all the way back to the days when Black mothers braided seeds in the hair of their children as they embarked on slave ships. Okay, it goes all the way back. All these movements that we see today, these are movements against ICE, movements against the discrimination of Muslim people, movements for queer and trans prisoners. Okay, when we talk about the new Jim Crow and 13, this is a part of that legacy and a part of that resistance. And so I wanted to share just a little clip. Let me just do a quick time today because of these movements. And so now we're seeing prison populations decrease, political prisoners be released. We're seeing parole reform happening. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a part of the New York State Prisoner Justice Network. And about 10 years ago, I got together with a group of activists, probably the amount that are at this table here, and we were sitting in a room and we were having a conversation at our social justice center in Albany, New York, about what we could do as people from upstate New York to bring our people home that we were working towards organizing for. And we thought to ourselves, wouldn't it be interesting if we could unite the people downstate, the people who are doing organizing in New York City around prisons, and unite them with us, and we work together on these issues, and we find some common ground to build together as people in upstate New York. Because as you know, here in New York State, most people who are getting locked up, the majority are from New York City, also Rochester, also Buffalo, and Albany, right? All the areas in New York State where there are predominantly people of color, Black people, okay? And then we look at where are the prisons? Where are the prisons here? Are the prisons, all the prisons downstate? Where are they?
Rural areas?
Rural areas in upstate New York, right? So we look at this issue and we thought to ourselves, wouldn't it be powerful if we could unite all of those that are doing work upstate with all of those doing work downstate? We had this idea. And we started a network. It's not really an organization, but it's really a network, a coalition, if you will, of over 100 organizations throughout New York State doing work on prisoner justice. And from that came a conference and many, many meetings throughout the past 10 years. And other coalitions similar to that have formed. And from that, we are seeing some tremendous organizing happening. One of the things that came out of that first conference that we did was we wanted to know from the folks that we were representing who are incarcerated, what was the issue that was most important to you as people who are incarcerated that you want us to work on? And one of the things that they told us was parole. So parole, people being going up for parole, right, and then being resentenced, basically, being retried for the same crime that they committed, not looking at all the things that they've done since they've been incarcerated, their behavior since they've been incarcerated. They're only looking at the original crime, the so-called crime that they committed. And so people were not being released on parole in the way that they should be. And so one of the things that people who have been a part of organizing around that have done is shift who is on the parole board to have more of our people on the parole board, and have been pushing to change parole, to change the laws around parole and how people, what the parole board is supposed to do once people are up for parole. And we have already begun to see profound changes in terms of the number of people that are now being released on parole. And as I mentioned earlier, I am a part of the political prisoner movement. As I said at the beginning of that conversation, we were a group of people about the size of your table having this conversation, dreaming about how to release these political prisoners. And just this past year, 2 of those New York State political prisoners that we were working to free because of these changes in parole finally got released after 40 years of incarceration. So this is good news, believe it or not. These are some other things that are happening here in New York State. I was mentioning to you all earlier, I'm a part of an organization called Soul Fire Farm. I'm not a farmer, but I'm on the board of the farm, and I do love to grow food. And we have a restorative justice program that happens on the farm. And we also do work to reconnect BIPOC people, so Black, Indigenous people of color, to the land. So as we spoke of earlier, all of our, many of our skilled agricultural laborers were stolen from Africa, brought to the United States, enslaved, and used to build this country, right, to continue the agricultural work in this country. And so we, as a people, a very small percentage of people of color actually own the farms in this country. And so part of what we do is we train people to reconnect them to land, to growing food, to health, to wellness. And we do that with youth who have been caught up in the system as well. This is Jalal over here. He's with the Victory Bus Project. And Jalal is a food justice farmer as well, but he works with farmers to actually get what's called CSAs, they're community supported agriculture, so he gets like boxes of vegetables, and he takes families to visit their loved ones in prison on this bus, and he brings these vegetables, so each family gets a box of vegetables. They talk about issues on the bus on the way to the prison, and families get to feed themselves and their loved ones healthy food as they see their families who are incarcerated. This is the Audre Lorde Project. This is based in New York City, and they are an organization that are doing work on what we call transformative justice. So when a lot of people talk about, incarceration in prisons, a lot of people will say, well, what's the alternative to that? What's the alternative to prisons? If we don't want prisons, what's the alternative? And Audre Lorde Project and many other organizations across the nation are doing, and across the world, are doing, working on that very question, and have been forming transformative justice models, ways of holding one another accountable in community, in ways that take into account people's full humanity. Okay, that's a whole nother topic, a whole nother workshop within itself. But I highly recommend Google transformative justice. There's many articles and podcasts, and of course, take a look at the work that's happening with the Audre Lorde Project. And then we have the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. What's that? The last one? Okay. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project. This is an organization. We looked at Sylvia Rivera was one of the trans sisters that was protesting in the 1970s. This is an organization that's named after her in New York City that, as it says, is doing work on gender liberation and racial and economic justice, and doing legal advocacy work for trans people. There's a lot of work that's happening around supporting trans people who are incarcerated, making sure to fight so that one of the things that we didn't get to talk about was youth and incarceration, which I hope to add to this workshop later on. But I am connected with organizers who've been working to make sure that, for example, youth, trans youth who are brought into detention facilities are able to be put into populations according to their gender. And also, one of the things that I wanted to mention, just to roll back a little bit, in terms of some of the powerful work that's been happening around New York State, is that we had a movement here called Raise the Age. So New York State was one of, I believe it was 2 states that still could try young people as adults and put them and lock them up in adult facilities. And so we worked as a part of the prisoner justice movements here in New York State on a movement called Raise the Age. And luckily, we were able to pass that. And so that's no longer the case in New York State, part of some of the amazing work that's happening here. And then, I don't have pictures for this, but there's a lot of different ways to get involved. There are organizers here in Rochester, a lot of organizations in upstate New York that are doing work on these issues. And I believe that there's an organization at University of Rochester that's specifically a student organization. So if that's something that you want to continue to look at and possibly organize around, I will get you guys in touch with that organization and see how you guys can work together. But yeah, that's basically my workshop. I think we hit our time, and with a little bit of time, maybe we could do like 5 or 10 minutes of Q&A and discussion. But that's what I have. Thank you. So any questions, comments, thoughts?
So can you differentiate between prisons and jails?
Mm-hmm. So jails, well, Gaetano, I didn't introduce Gaetano. This is Gaetano. This is my partner in love, music, and revolution. And Gaetano filmed the Freedom music video that we saw and has been working on my computer. I'm terrible at tech, so Gaetano helps me with like tech stuff. But would you like to answer that question? You don't want to be with okay. So jails are. And to be honest, I think it's a little bit challenging for me to answer that as well. But one of the things that is important to understand is that people who are in jail might be in jail before they have been sentenced for a crime. So say they are, what is the word I'm looking for? Say that they are arrested and they're put in jail for a period of time. We have what's called bail, right? So you would have to pay money in order to say that the judge says that you have to pay a certain amount of money in order to be taken out of jail while you await a trial. So many people can't pay that money, and so they end up staying in jail without ever being sentenced for a crime. Okay. So as far as I understand it, once they're, and if anybody else has a better answer to this question, I would love to hear your response. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, please.
I think also that it's local to the area where you got arrested. far away from where you live?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But, Gaetano, you mentioned to me earlier that, and I haven't read this myself, but if you want to answer.
So, and the budget for New York State was just passed, and so there was a number of things that went through that. One of them, as part of the prisons, was that they are eliminating cash bail for nonviolent offenses and misdemeanors, which is not everything, but it means that for a large majority of crimes, which right now, minor crimes, which are keeping people in prison for essentially an indefinite amount of time. Because they are in there just awaiting trial, that can mean a month, that can mean a year, that can mean a year and a half. This has now passed so that in, I believe, 2020, that cash bail for those offenses is going to be removed.
Right. I forgot to finish my thought that I was saying a second ago, which is that, so with that issue around bail, some people were sitting in jails for a long time, as Gaetano was saying, months, up to, what was it, years in prison, in jails. And one of the things that we were seeing were people, I'm not sure how many people, but a number of people had committed suicide in jail. Or after being in jail for a period of time, and say they were in jail for a period of time and then they were found to be innocent, that trauma of being incarcerated, being in jail, awaiting a trial, and of course we see that racial disparity there too in terms of like the racial/economic disparity of people who do have the money for bail and don't have to wait for a trial in jail.
With like the legalization of marijuana, are people going to be like released from prisons if they were like put in prison for like having a certain amount of it?
As of right now, no. And that's a big issue in terms of, that the conversation around the legalization of marijuana is that, it's interesting because as white people start to benefit economically from the legalization of marijuana in terms of building these, marijuana empires, people of color who have been criminalized continue to be locked up, right? In Colorado and in Oregon and in Washington, all of these places where marijuana has been legal. As I understand it, and I don't know a lot about it, in California, people are organizing for that, and I think they have made some headway.
I think they got a little bit of headway, but people are really pushing for retroactive. People who were, if you were sentenced, a couple of months ago and then all of a sudden it's legalized, do you still have to serve the remaining of your sentence now that it's legal? So that's what people are pushing for, as people were locked up for longer periods of time for things that are now legal.
What do you have to say to people that say that, I don't know, I guess people in the minority groups like blacks and like Hispanics or whatever, that if they commit a crime, but they're given like an insane sentence that's like obviously not fit for whatever the crime they did, what do you have to say to people that say, oh well, they shouldn't have like committed the crime, they wouldn't have been in the first place, but the sentence that they got or the conviction that they got, it still isn't like right.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's racial inequality, right? That's not just, as a mother of a black son today, one of the things that I have to contend with is knowing that when, he is a teenager, as teenagers will be teenagers, and we all make mistakes, right? Especially in our youth, that what he has to face, if he were to ever have to face police or face a judge, or even in school, right? He's going to potentially have to face an inequality in terms of how he's judged and how he's sentenced, how he's tried. So I think that what I would say is, we all have a right to a fair trial. That's supposed to be our right as citizens of this country. There are a lot of organizations that are working on those issues. And one of the things that we did as the New York State Prison and Justice Network is we put together a handbook. It's a directory of all of those organizations that are doing that work throughout New York State. So if there's somebody who is struggling with one of those issues, you can go to our website and find that directory and direct them to an organization that might be able to support them. Any other questions? You had your hand raised earlier, and I didn't know if you remembered your question.
Yeah, I was thinking of a question.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was wondering, is there currently an option if, for example, maybe if a judge thinks that someone who has committed a crime would be likely to reoffend or something like that, maybe have them do a community service? I was wondering. I'm just wondering what can be done to truly end mass incarceration, because aren't there judges who think that aren't there certain judges who think that certain races are more likely to reoffend than others, perhaps?
So, a couple of things. So I would say certainly there are judges that have been shown to be discriminatory and have been shown in their records. Some have even been debarred for that, but it just shows that it's just the tip of the iceberg. But as far as there's been a lot of initiatives to try to push for like community service instead of this, or reducing sentences, particularly around mandatory minimum sentences, where judges are forced to give a certain amount of time in prison, like we saw with the crack cocaine sentencing. So there's been a lot of movements to reduce those types of things, but it's moving slowly right now. But I think that's the purpose of these organizations, this resistance movements, to be able to speed up that process of people looking into alternatives.
There are restorative justice.
Yeah.
There are restorative justice programs that do exist, and that's what I was showing you with the Soul Fire Farm image. So that was an example of one of those restorative justice programs. That's a part of the system where youth, and I'm not sure where they are, youth who are perhaps, I think they're at a detention facility, can come to the farm and do some work on the farm as volunteer work as their community service. So yes, they do exist, and people are doing a lot of work to run those programs. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
How do mental health issues play into mass incarceration?
Thank you. So there are, it's a big topic, but in short, people with mental health issues, people are incarcerated in unequally. They're what's the word I'm looking for? They are over incarcerated, and then also dealing with what is the word I'm looking for? They are put in solitary confinement a lot of times. And so there's an organization, and I'm trying to think of the name of the organization right now. It's going to come to me in a minute. I'll think of it and I'll tell you after the talk. But there are organizations that are working to support people with mental health issues in prisons, and also to stop the solitary confinement, because that causes a lot of trauma, and those folks are it continues to exacerbate mental health issues. People are not getting the medication that they need in prisons, etc. I wish I could think of this organization's name, because it's an organization that we work with in the New York State Prison Justice Network. Go ahead.
Also, I feel like it ties into the sentencings around drugs and criminalizing addiction, and that, along with many other types of mental illnesses, and rather than treating them on a bigger level as a health thing, as a health problem, that it's criminalized. It's put into the prison systems.
Yeah.
What are the studies that found the judges were discriminatory? I think that would be interesting to read.
specific studies, I'm not sure. I know that I've seen at least one or two specific judges who were debarred for either being paid off to incarcerate specifically young black men. But I don't know if there's a specific study that I'm referring to, but it's kind of just a trend that is well documented. Yeah.
Were they paid off by private prisons? And on top of that, why would you even have private prisons?
Great question. That's where the piece of like making the money and the social repression, but certainly making money is a piece of this. Where anything that's privatized, right, can become a problem.
Oh, did you finish answering the question? NAMI, the New York State, what does NAMI stand for? The New York State Alliance for Mental Health Initiative, something like that. In New York State, National Alliance on Mental Health Initiative, something along that line. They're called NAMI in their organization, so I think that would be a great place to start to answer that question. Incarceration is, this mass incarceration is a massive topic. I'm certainly not an expert on every aspect of incarceration, but I can absolutely direct you to resources and other organizations that are doing that work that can have that information for you. I do have to end the talk now because I have to head back to Albany in the snow. And I want to make sure that I get on the road in a timely manner so that we don't get stuck in the storm when it gets dark. But I want to thank you all for your questions and for coming and listening. I'm happy to talk a little bit as we walk out. Thank you.
And remember, Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
You guys can take a pin if you want. The movement will have it coming back Tuesday for elections.